Thank you, Tom. That was a very nice introduction. I remember when I was much younger, maybe just a little older than most of you, I gave my very first talk in Philadelphia. I was still a graduate student, and I had an introduction, not as nice as the one Tom just gave me. And they rounded up the local intellectual, a dentist, as I remember, who gave an introduction something like this. Well, this guy is going to talk to you about something. I'm not sure what, and I hope not too long. Anyway, I will try not too long to talk to you so that we get out of here in time for your next class. What I want to talk to you today is about a story of why, when, and how a genocide of the Armenians and Assyrians of the Ottoman Empire happened. I use the word genocide deliberately. The United States of America, along with Israel and a number of other countries, Turkey, of course, does not recognize the deportations, forced assimilation, and mass murder of Armenians and Assyrians in 1915 as a genocide. I'll try to show why it is a genocide as I go through this talk. The story I'm telling is a story of a moment of historical passage, a moment when empires attempted to accommodate themselves, to adjust to the rise of nation states, to a transforming world of global capitalism in which nations and national states were challenging these traditional empires to their power, the sources of their own legitimacy. The first thing to remember around the time of World War I is these empires were not ready to give up or give in. They meant to modernize themselves to become something slightly different so that they could survive into the next century. And survive they did. Empires don't actually begin to disappear until after World War II. And the last one, the last great landed one, the Soviet Union, only in 1991. So what was it? How were these empires going to transform themselves to the irresistible pressures of nationalism, of popular empowerment, that is something like democracy, and new regimes like in the United States and in Western Europe that were based on equality and merit rather than inherited privilege and hierarchy. Now, if you look back from our own day or from the future toward that moment in 1914, 1915, the Ottoman Empire and others looked as if they were on the brink of collapse. And yet their leaders neither believed this nor would accommodate themselves to it. So the talk I'm giving today and the book on which it is based, which is available on Amazon, not too expensive, it's called They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, on the history of the Armenian genocide. As you probably know, studying history, the recovery of a difficult past is a challenge to those I would call the assassins of memory, to those who would, through distorting sophistries, deny or minimize the enormity of a human tragedy. All nations and states have long been in the business of fabricating, sometimes more honestly than at other times, myths and stories of their origins, their golden ages, their heroic deeds, their victories and triumphs, while eliminating the blemishes of defeats and failures, even mass murders. I was given a wonderful tour by my friend Mark Rees today of your campus, and there were these wonderful flags from the War of 1812, which, as I remember, we did lose that one, right? Okay. What appears to be new in our own time is the brazenness of what is claimed and the blatant cynicism of the perpetrators and their potential reach through the prints and mass media, through the internet, film, and so forth. Historians inevitably are pulled reluctantly into this war of images and words. And what is the only weapon we have against bad history? That history deployed for political or personal vindication. The only weapon we have, and it's a hard one, is scrupulous investigation that results in evidence-based narration and analysis of what it might be possible to know. Nevertheless, we still see these proliferation of what you might call usable pasts and preferred realities that are a challenge to the historians. But you as midshipmen, I as a historian, we have to be careful. We have to try to see the world as it really is, to get careful and accurate readings of existence, because as you'll learn, and as I've learned, reality has a nasty habit of biting back. There are two big stories that are told about the genocide of Armenians in 1915. On one side, the Armenian story, and those of most historians, by the way, that the Armenians, who were subjects of this great Turkish empire, the Ottoman Empire, were in fact a subject people who were largely innocent, living in that empire, attempting to survive against a government that was often tyrannical, that often engaged in mass killing, massacres, as in 1894-96, again in 1909, and then most fatally in 1915-1916, to limit, if not eliminate, the Armenian population. These various massacres and the Armenian telling of the story are part of a single narration, an organic story that was aimed for and ends in genocide, right? That's one story. The other story is the story that is told officially by the Turkish government to this very day, and by a small handful of what I wouldn't call scholars, but pseudo-scholars, who distort the record in order to prove there was no genocide. There was no genocide. The Armenians were actually rebels. They were engaged in an insurrection against the Ottoman government, and therefore they got what they deserved. During war, they were cavorting with the Russians, whom the Ottomans were fighting, and therefore it's understandable why the government and ordinary people might turn against these Christian subjects of this Islamic empire. In other words, in the Turkish story, raison d'etat, reasons of state, or what we would call national security, justified the suppression of rebellion, and mass killing was explained as the unfortunate residue, or what we call fashionably today, the collateral damage in in this effort to maintain order. This position, which those who recognize the genocide call denialist, might be summarized as the following: there was no genocide, and the Armenians are to blame for it. They were rebellious, seditious subjects who presented a real danger to the empire, and they got what they deserved. There had been relative peace and harmony in the Ottoman Empire between the state and religious minorities, as long as they obeyed the law and paid their taxes. But then along came outside agitators, usually from the Russian Empire, Armenian revolutionaries, or, imagine this, American missionaries, who stirred up the Armenians, aroused their nationalist and separatist passions. The Armenians wanted us to separate from the empire. Still, the denialists claim, despite this existential threat posed by the Armenians and their Russian allies to the survival of the empire, there was no intention, say official Turkish government sources, no intention or effort by the Young Turk regime to eliminate the Armenians as a people. So those are the two stark stories that we have. And I'm going to try to give you what I call the radical middle position. I hate to be out-radicalized, so I'm giving you a position somewhat in the middle to try to explain something that even my Armenian colleagues sometimes have trouble with. That is, Armenians have said to me, don't, in fact, try to explain this genocide in the Ottoman Empire, because if you try to explain it, you will justify it. You will make it rational. And the Turks, indeed, may look too good. And so they abjure the job of the historian, which is trying to explain the why of why something would happen. So the argument I want to make today, and I won't have time to go into great details, but the book is available on Amazon. The argument I will make today is different. First of all, This is not a religious struggle. Armenians were Christian, indeed the first Christian nation, we say. We were Christian just before the Roman Empire. Some Armenians even say we were Christian before Christ, but that's impossible. But anyway, we go way back. We go way, way back. And the empire was a Muslim empire. And one could say, well, wasn't it simply a Christian-Muslim struggle? Well, it turns out not quite. Armenians were marked as different and as Christian, yes. But there's no genocide against Greeks at this time, though there was some repression. They were also Christian. Secondly, the government that actually carried out the genocide, the Young Turk government, a government of militant reformers who came to power in 1908 and would survive for 10 years till they were overthrown at the end of World War I. The Young Turks were not particularly religious. Some were, but most of them were secular modernists. They wanted the empire to become more like Europe. So they might mark Armenians as different, but they saw them as an existential threat for other reasons, not because of their religion, but because they were an internal subversive group. This is the way they saw Armenians, allied to Europe. Europe kept using Armenians as a wedge to get reform within the empire, and they were allied, they claimed, with the Russians, with whom war broke out, started by the Ottomans in late 1914. So I don't buy the religious argument, though there certainly are religious elements. There are people who killed Armenians because they were Christian as well. The second argument I have trouble with is the argument that this was a clash of nationalisms, Armenian nationalism against Turkish nationalism. Now that has some strong elements in it, because what the Young Turks were interested in doing, in modernizing their empire, was making it more Islamic and more national, more Turkic, but not a nation state. These Turks, these Young Turks, were not giving up empire, big, diverse, ruling over different peoples. They weren't going to give up the Middle East. They weren't giving up Palestine or Iraq. They were going to have a multinational empire, but one that in its heartland, as they now pictured Anatolia, that peninsula that you see here, that would be more Turkic and more Islamic. So they allied with the Kurds, local Muslims, and those groups together would help to make this genocide. So I've given up so many explanations. What will be the explanation that I have left? Before I get to the why, I want to tell you the what, because many of you may be unfamiliar with what actually happened in 1915. And by telling you the what, then I give you a chance to understand the events as they occurred. Here's some pictures. These are somewhat idealized pictures of Armenians in the empire. One on the right here, on my right, is a wealthy man. You can see he's in Ottoman dress. On the left is a hamal, a porter. So Armenians represented all kinds of parts of the empire. They existed as a kind of bourgeoisie. You might say, like Jews in Central Europe, Armenians were often the photographers, the dentists, the craftsmen of the empire. They lived rather well in Istanbul. The head of the mint, who minted the coins of the empire, they were Armenians. The emperor's, the sultan's own architect, the Balyan family, were Armenians. They lived well. They often dressed and celebrated their ancient culture. Here's Armenian women. You can see, were quite decent and genteel middle-class families. Again, local musicians in the town of Mersin. They built literally hundreds, even 1,000 churches throughout the Anatolian lands. They had been there 1,000 years before the first Turks emerged. They were organized around a church, the Armenian church, a Christian church, but one which was particular and nationalist. In other words, Armenians took the universal religion of Christianity and made it our own national special religion of a special church, like Orthodox peoples have done elsewhere as well. There were also political. They were active politically. Before 1908, they formed revolutionary groups to try to force the Sultan to give reforms against the marauding pillaging Kurds and other nomadic peoples in eastern Anatolia. Here's a group, and they look pretty fierce, terrorists of their time, and terrorist was even a positive term in their mind, who had a banner which said, Azatuchun Umay, freedom or death. Here's one of the most intrepid of those guys, an Anatolian Armenian himself, Antranik, who would later fight with the Turks for Armenian rights. Well, the Armenians lived in this empire. They were always second-class citizens. They were subjects of the emperor, of the sultan. And occasionally there would be massacres, as in 1894-96, to keep those Armenians in their place. But those massacres in 1896 were not massacres to eliminate Armenians. They were to punish them. They were considered, you might call, exemplary repression, to keep Armenians obedient to the servant. My own grandmother left Armenia at that time, came to America when her family was destroyed in those massacres of the 1890s. Well, that bloody Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, was overthrown in 1908, and Armenians and Greeks and Jews and Arabs and Turks and Kurds, not Kurds so much, all celebrated the new arrival of a constitutional government, of a moment of reform. And it looked as if things were going to change. In history, when you raise expectations, beware if you dash those expectations. For a year later, there were massacres again of Armenians in the town on the Mediterranean called Adana. Now, they occurred largely out of fear of local Muslims, of Armenians, and the Armenians were attacked. There was fighting back and forth, and about 20,000 Armenians eventually died in these massacres. My grandfather, who lived in central Turkey, an Armenian, decided there's no future in Turkey, and he migrated to the United States, where he met my grandmother after these massacres. So both sides of my family, but the mother's side from Turkey, did not experience the genocide per se. And who came to power? This fellow. His name is Talat Pasha, and he was one of these secular modernizers. T-A-L-A-T is good enough. Pasha, of course, is not his last name. Pasha is simply general, a high official in Turkey. And these secular modernizers, trying to change the empire and make it more like a Western European country, though keeping it as an empire, in fact, began to adopt various nationalist rhetoric. Countries of Europe were still picking away at the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks were taking some islands. The Italians took Libya in 1911. In 1908, Austro-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so the Turks and the Ottomans felt very endangered and vulnerable by the appetite of European imperial powers. And still, they had to find a way to modernize. Unfortunately, eventually, it was decided that they had to eliminate internal threats. And the one they imagined was that of the Armenians. Now, in 1912, 1913, the Ottoman Empire faced a series of attacks by the small nations of the Baltic region. Maybe I can show you on this map. Let's see if it works. Going back. Yes. So these countries here, Bulgaria and Greece, even Albania, which was Islamic, Bulgaria, all of these countries attacked Greece and attacked the Ottoman Empire and drove the Turks out of all of Europe. This was all part of Turkey, except this one part here, which was called Rumeli, or near the city of Edirne. And as a result of that imperial loss, the rhetoric in Turkey, when you read the journals, becomes extraordinarily violent. They begin to talk about revenge. They begin to talk about danger from internal enemies, from Christians or Armenians. And they begin to picture the Armenians, to represent them as this fifth column, that term didn't yet exist, internal enemies that had to be eliminated. Now the interesting thing is, even though this was developing in the vision of Talat and of his comrades Enver Pasha and Cemal Pasha, shown here in Jerusalem, even though this was occurring at that time, in fact, the Armenians, most Armenians, almost all Armenians, wanted to stay within the Ottoman Empire. They just wanted a safe, secure life. They wanted reform. Every Armenian Revolutionary Party, after 1908, gave up its revolutionary aims and decided they would work with the constitutional regime of the Young Turks. In fact, if you fault the Armenians, you could say they believed in the Young Turks too long. They stayed loyal even as the Young Turks were gathering the forces to commit genocide. Okay, so this is the story. Let me tell you about those events. As I mentioned, in 1912, 1913, the Young Turks lost the Balkan Wars against the small nations of the Balkans. And the European powers forced them to adopt a new reform plan, which the Sultan agreed to in 1914. There would be a new setup in Anatolia, and the Armenian provinces would have European inspectors to check to see if there was going to be real reform in the area. The Turks, the Ottomans didn't like this new reform. It gave too much power to these Christian peoples. But if they had been willing to accept it, Turkey would have evolved in a different way, perhaps as a federal state, perhaps as a more tolerant and more liberal empire. But in fact, they fought against it. And in 1914, as the clouds of war spread over Europe, the Young Turks had to decide, these guys had to decide, shall we join the Russians, the British, and the French in the Entente, or should we join Germany and Austro-Hungary in the Central Powers? Well, Russia had been a traditional enemy. The British had picked off pieces of the empire. The Germans didn't have that many claims on the Ottoman Empire. They were building a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad. They seemed like a better bet. Also, the Young Turks tried to negotiate with the Russians. Talat Pasha even went to see the Tsar in Crimea. You all know where Crimea is nowadays, right? But the Tsar and the British and the Russians all said, no, you have to put these reforms into reality, make them real. And the Young Turks didn't want to do that. They preferred another solution. So here is the map. Now you see the eastern frontier of the Ottoman Empire here, bordering on Russia and bordering on Persia. And the Armenians lived in that whole region out there, the kind of yellowish part. And all of that, Lake Van, all of that area there, which is now Kurdistan, but was Armenia, or historic Armenia, in that time. The Young Turks went to the Ottomans. The Young Turks went to the Armenians and said, we'll make a deal with you. You agree to fight for the empire, and we will give you some rights. But you must also convince the Armenians on the other side of the frontier, Russian Armenians, to also fight for us, for the Ottomans. The leading Armenian party, the Dashnak Sutyun, the Dashnaks, said, look, we in the Ottoman Empire will be loyal to the Ottoman Empire. We will even help you mobilize our young Armenian men to fight in the army. And they did. Tens of thousands of young Armenian men joined the Ottoman army to fight against the Russians in that war and defend the Ottoman homeland. But Armenians in Russia joined volunteer units, about 4,000 Armenians, against the Ottoman army. And so a great battle occurred in that area along the frontier at a place called Commish, mountainous area, today Turkey's leading ski resort. And in that area, Enver Pasha suffered a colossal defeat. Here's a drawing at the moment, a Russian drawing of the Battle of Commish. And here's what was left of the Turkish army. Some 40,000 soldiers died in this colossal battle. Enver had led his troops. He was humiliated. He rushed back to Istanbul, and a new a new myth developed. We lost that battle because of the treachery of the Armenians. After Sadi Commish, those Armenians, soldiers, in Ottoman uniform, were demobilized, their weapons taken away from them, they were turned into work battalions, and eventually they were murdered. The first step of the genocide was to remove the muscle of the Armenian community, the young men. Almost simultaneously, Armenians were then rounded up, men primarily, taken out of towns in eastern Anatolia and elsewhere, and driven into the deserts. Here's a map that tells of the trail of tears of Armenians from all over the empire being gathered, marched through the mountains and valleys into the deserts of Syria. They went to places now familiar to you, to Deir Zor, to Raqqa. Raqqa is today the capital of the so-called Islamic State, right? Those desert places were completely empty, devoid of food. Armenians were sent there to die and starve to death by the hundreds of thousands. The genocide has three prongs. One was to remove people physically, murder them, as they did with the soldiers and with most of the men and the elite of the empire. The second was by mass deportation into these desolate areas where they might live in small groups or they might be eliminated altogether. And the third was through forced Islamization, to turning Armenian Christians into Muslims. That was done primarily to women and small children. Men were hardly ever given that option except small boys. Three prongs. And by mass killing, mass deportation, and mass conversion to Islam, you would eliminate this population. You could say that the Armenian genocide was a gendered genocide. Men and women were treated differently. Men were more likely to die than women, poor people more likely to die than rich people. At the end of 1916, 90% of all Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were gone, either murdered, either forcibly assimilated, or migrating, forced to migrate to the Russian Empire, a few rescued by ships off the coast of Anatolia. The numbers are staggering. This was the greatest atrocity in World War I. It was nothing had been seen like this in European history in many centuries. 600,000 to 1.2 million were probably killed or died of disease or forced killing in the period. The terms did not exist to describe it. The word genocide had not yet been invented. It would be invented in the Second World War by Raphael Lemkin to describe the Armenian genocide and the Jewish Holocaust by the Nazis. Those who observed the killings tried to find a word to describe it, and they borrowed it from the Bible. They called it Holocaust. That was the only word they had. So why did it happen? What is it about? What kind of explanation can I provide for you? Well, the causes of genocide, and here you see some people defending the city of Van against the Turks who have already begun massacring the villages outside. This was used by the Young Turks, the defense of a few places like Musadar and Van, as proof that the Armenians were insurgents and were fighting on the side of the Russians. They were defending themselves. They largely went quietly to their graves, in fact, but in a few places they stood up and tried to resist. There was no insurrection by Armenians coordinated throughout the empire. There was no mass rebellion. Most Armenians were trying to live within the empire, but they wanted a different kind of empire, one in which they could have reforms and could survive. The actual genocide began on April 24th, 1915, a day we still mark as Genocide Day, when the Intellectuals, leading intellectuals, several hundred of them were arrested in Istanbul, sent from the city, and most of them were massacred. First, they had removed the muscle of the Armenian community. Then, by taking the political and intellectual leaders, writers, and so forth, journalists, they removed the brain. And then it was easy to deal with children, old people, and the women left defenseless. There are a few pictures, some German soldiers, some intrepid missionaries, because there were still American missionaries out here. And American missionaries and doctors were trying to save the Armenians they could in Van, in other cities as well. These are just some of the horrible pictures of the massacres at the time. This is a fake picture. There would be Armenian propaganda afterwards to try to say that, that the Turks were taunting, but things like this occurred. And afterwards, there was a huge campaign to save the remaining Armenians, Near East relief, and so forth after the war. So, why genocide? Why these terrible, terrible events occurred? What is it that I can tell you about the causes of these events? First of all, the events are both immediate and long-term. And what I want to do here is bring a new way of understanding political events to your attention. I believe that actors in politics not only act rationally, strategically, figuring out how to reach by the best means some goal, but they also work emotionally. That emotions play a big role in why people take certain actions. I just urge you to look at one of these Republican debates that have been going on and see how much emotion is involved in the way people are trying to garner votes, through fear, through depicting people as enemies, etc. Politics is very often an area, a theater of fear as well. The Young Turk leaders began over time to develop what I call an affective disposition. Affective is a fancy way of saying emotional. An affective disposition, an emotional view of the world in which the Armenians, who before they had thought we were loyal subjects, have become an internal, existential, deadly threat that had to be eliminated. Adolf Hitler had an affective disposition about Jews. They were some kind of virus, some bacilli, some force that was infecting and destroying the good, strong, blonde, blue-eyed people here, race of the Germans. And therefore they had to be eliminated. In his warped, strange affective disposition, he was getting rid of an internal existential threat. The Young Turks imagined in their own pathological affective disposition that Armenians were precisely these kinds of people. You couldn't bargain with them. You couldn't integrate them. You had to eliminate them physically by moving them, killing them, or turning them into Muslims. Note, the Young Turks did not have a racist idea of Armenians. That is, Jews were thought to be racially different, and therefore biologically they had to be eliminated. Armenians, at least those who couldn't defend themselves like women and children, could be assimilated. Today, by the way, hundreds of thousands of Islamicized Armenians and their descendants are re-emerging in Turkey. We've had a conference recently in Istanbul in which these people have been telling their family histories, remembering now, after almost 100 years, who they were. So when you look at politics, when you look at why such an event occurred, you need to look at the genealogy of the mental world, rational and emotional, the affective disposition of what led these people to imagine that some of their loyal subjects had now become something quite different. I end with this thought, because this is a historic event, 100 years old, but it is an event that still has resonance today. Still today, the Turks and the US government refuse to recognize that this is a genocide, even though President Obama said that before he was elected, but for narrow state reasons, pragmatic reasons, he refuses to insult our ally Turkey, since we need that base in Turkey and their help in fighting the Islamic State. The Armenian genocide, along with the killing of Assyrians, and later the expulsion in 1922-23 of the Anatolian Greeks, those ethnic cleansings, those deportations and killings, laid the ground for the nation state that we now call the Republic of Turkey. The diversity of the Ottoman Empire was made through force and violence into this more harmonious and homogeneous state. But the very allies of the Turks in 1915, the Kurds, who carried out so many of these massacres, are today the victims of the Turkish government, which today is bombing the Kurds in Iraq and even in Turkey, and killing young Kurds who want autonomy, some recognition. You know, you can't even study Kurdish in a school in Turkey. There are 18 to 20 to 22 million Kurds who cannot learn their own and study in their own language. So these problems exist. What was historic Armenia out there in the east is present-day Kurdistan. My daughter is out there in Van studying the Kurds in a very dangerous situation. I'm not so thrilled about that. But that has become a new problem that was fostered by the old problem. Present-day Kurds recognize the genocide, have apologized to Armenians. Sorry we did this, the Turks made us do it. They blame the Turks. We've lived here for 100 years. You built some very nice houses. We're happy about that. But still, Turks, Kurds and Armenians are kind of allies against this distorting, denialist version of what happened in 1915. And there are lessons to be learned from this genocide. Like many other states today, including Australia, Israel, and our own country, the United States, we emerged as a nation, like the Republic of Turkey, by removing and subordinating native peoples, peoples who had lived on our territory prior to its founding by Europeans. The connection between ethnic cleansing or genocide and the legitimacy of the national state is what lays at the basis of the desperate efforts by many distorting history to deny what actually happened, how states, modern states and nations have been formed. I say, maybe the lesson of 1915 is that we should come to terms with that history. We should do the hard job of recognizing our own dark spots. And that would give us maybe some salvation, some salutary effect of questioning the continued policies in our own world of ethnic homogenization and the refusal to recognize the claims and rights of those peoples, minorities, or diasporas. Think of them all around the world: Australian Aborigines, Native Americans, Kurds, Assyrians, Palestinians, and Armenians, peoples who refuse to disappear. Thank you.
Really brilliant. Thank you for your time today. We have some time for some questions.
Professor, you touch on there being both emotional and rational thought behind these political decisions. Do you think the modern rejection of the Armenian genocide by the Turkish government is more based in rational decision-making or emotional? And what do you think the American politicians have to understand about this rejection when we contemplate our relationship with Turkey today?
Thank you. Very good question. I'm so impressed by the questions I've been getting this morning and at this talk. Thank you so much. I would say, you tell me if this is rational or emotional. Turks today, modern Turks, and I speak a lot of Turkey, I'm going to Istanbul next week. Turks today have what I would call a very fragile national identity. They're not sure who they are, right? Is their identity primarily Islamic? Well, it's a very secular state. They've gone through the Kemalist revolution for 70 years. Are they a power that once was a great empire like Russia and now is in decline? Are they Europeans? Are they Asians? And by the way, if you scratch a Turk, you might find an Islamicized Armenian, or maybe someone who married a Kurd, or was Circassian, or Chechen, or something else. In the fragility of that identity, Turks will say, we are not those kind of people who could have committed such an act. We were not genocide. There must have been a reason. The Armenians were a real threat. I'm trying to say today, Armenians were not a real threat. And by the way, even if they were a real threat, you don't genocide people, even if it is a real threat. You deal with it in many other different ways. But in any case, this was an imagined pathological creation. So I see it as deeply emotional, but also somewhat strategic and rational. That is, the current government of Erdogan is using the Armenian genocide as a way to convince nationalist Turks that they ought to vote for his party, right? So there's also that kind of strategic thing going on. And they're also fearful that Armenians may make claims on Turkish territory or ask for reparations. Armenia itself has given up any claims like that. There are some diaspora parties like the Dashnak Suchun that do continue doing that, but that's not real. So I ask Turks all the time, why don't you give up this problem? Why don't you just recognize the genocide? Get it off your agenda. You got real problems. You got Cyprus. You got trying to get into the European Union. You've got the Kurdish problem. That could divide your state. You've got all kinds of problems. Why this one? But in fact, I think your question implies this is so deeply ingrained in a kind of emotional idea of who's a Turk that they can't give it up. Thanks.
Any more questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I know that you've been in the forefront. I mean, people have always said that the scholars on all sides should come together and try to forge some discussion. Thank you for all of the efforts you've made over many years to do this. And I wonder if you could give us a kind of discussion of where that whole dialogue stands. I know there have been a lot of progress which you pointed to has been made. I just wondered if you could reflect on that for a moment.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. So I'll tell it as a story. It's a bit of a personal story, but I'll try to be brief. In 1998, a student of mine was teaching at Koç University in Istanbul. And he said, Professor Suny, I'd like you to come and give a lecture here. And I said, well, you know, if I come to Turkey to give a lecture, I'm going to talk about the Armenian genocide, which at that time was illegal. You could be arrested. And he said, oh, I don't care what you talk about, because I'm leaving anyway soon. So, you know. So I went to a Turkish colleague in Michigan, my friend Müge Göçek, and I said, Mügecan, what if I go to Turkey? What will happen? She's a very wealthy Turk. She comes from what's called Beyaz Turk. You know, she's a white Turk. She said, oh, Ronald, don't worry, no problem. If anything happens to you, we can get you out. I told this to my mother, who wasn't so thrilled, right? And you have to remember, Turks and Armenians at that time particularly completely hated each other, didn't understand each other. I gave the talk to a wonderful audience, young people in English, well educated. They began to ask interesting questions. No one denied or challenged the veracity of what I was saying. They only wanted to understand what was going on. They asked a question like that young gentleman there about, why is this such a problem for us? Because of the fragility of our identity. So I came back, we began organizing workshops. We call them Workshop in Armenian Turkish Scholarship. And we decided we're going to bring Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, German, American, all kinds of scholars together to discuss. We are about to have our 9th meeting in Istanbul at the 1st of October. And a dialogue began. Books appeared. The Turks then had their own conference, which the government tried to shut down. And we have now got a community I call progressive Turkish scholars, Kurdish scholars, who have recognized the genocide, are talking about it, are challenging the official view. That's what's happening. Will they all say genocide? Will they all say the G word? No, that's not possible. This is a genocide. And remember, genocide is not simply mass killing of people. There's a lot of mass killing, including war. Genocide is the deliberate mass killing of a people. You want to eliminate Jews. You want to eliminate Armenians, a designated group. And that's what the Turks carried out. And that's what they have trouble recognizing.
Any more questions? If you have time for one more.
I have time. It's your thing.
I've had questions. Is there absolutely no legitimacy to the
Right. There are people who argue it still. There's a guy, Edward Erickson, for instance, at the War College, who actually argues this, and you could read his book and see, he says, yes, but he contradicts himself in the book itself, as I point out in my own book. That is because there were incidents of defense, as I showed you, where Armenians realized we're about to be massacred. They'd run up on a hill, as in Musadagh or some other place in Urfa, and try to defend themselves. And that would be used as an excuse. Turks would, after 1908, Armenians for the first time were allowed to have weapons. They never were allowed, only Muslims could have weapons up to 1908. And so they would collect these weapons and say, look, they're planning this revenge. And to answer your question, there were still revolutionaries who would use means, they would say, to defend Armenians, but from the other side would be seen as rebellion, right? So all those incidents were sort of brought together in clusters to mean, look, there is evidence of insurrection.
One more question?
How does Ataturk fit into this? Did he help or hurt?
Ataturk, luckily, is not part of this event, right? Ataturk was way in the west. He was dealing with Gallipoli at the time. Later, afterwards, when he became powerful, he rarely spoke about it. At one point, he said something like, these young Turks, who he was then dealing with in some ways, though many in his government were young Turks, he said they did terrible things, you know, at that moment. At other times, he started this distorting view that would lead to the denialist account. But he did not participate in the genocide, happily.
Let's thank Professor Suny for his time today. So we have the ubiquitous U.S. Naval Academy gift for everyone who comes to the photo album. We'd like to present that to you.
Thank you.
We have the poster as well.
Oh, wonderful.
The poster that we created for you.
Thank you so much. I must say, I feel more patriotic today. Maybe it's all these white uniforms or whatever than I have felt in years. And you guys have such important things to do. I talk to undergraduates all the time. They're going to go out and maybe be doctors, lawyers, whatever, work for corporations, you know, whatever. You guys are going to make life and death decisions. And I hope studying history and learning what actually happened and the difficult dilemmas that it presents will be good for you. And thank you for being such a good audience.